Welcome to Show Me the Proof, Get to the Point, the B2B marketing podcast where we show you the proof in the form of case studies and success stories. And we get straight to the point with your hosts and founders of Proofpoint Marketing, Mike and Gabby Grinberg.
Welcome to Show Me the Proof, Get to the Point. We're excited to have Camille Trent join us on the show today. You may recognize Camille from such LinkedIn hits as the 2021 Sales Oddity. And Camille is also head of content at Dooley and recently launched a podcast called Content Logistics. So it's no surprise that today we're going to talk about content. Camille, it's great to have you with us and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. I hope that is what I am known for.
We'll find out. We'll see.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Be part of the lightning round.
Yeah,
it's that time in the that time in the day. Well, awesome, Camille. Thanks for chatting with us. And like Gabby said, we're looking forward to talking about content. So I know what we really want to focus on is our favorite topic, content repurposing. And I know you've been at Dooley only for a few months, but we want to chat about some of the things that you were doing at your former role over at Marketer Hire. So I guess let's jump into that. I know specifically we're going to talk about kind of how to leverage webinar content for pretty much everything.
Yeah, so I can dive in with some of the proof, like why you should care about this. But basically, we at Marketer Hire saw like hundreds of high intent leads come in from executing this strategy. And so that's the why. Like that's why you should care about this topic and care about this show specifically. And then if you'd like, I can just back up into to where it started as well.
Yeah, and really quick, I think we should, because
Restart.
high intent leads means different things to different people. So let's define in this case what high intent means, because I think that really sets the stage pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. So so Marketer Hire is a marketplace for finding freelance talent, right? And so the kind of next steps that we wanted people to take was to fill out our basically a brief, fill out a brief kind of questionnaire on what kind of company you're at, what you're looking for with the project. So it's a pretty lengthy form, and so there's some friction there in kind of getting people to go through it. And so these the high intent leads were people that were clicking on ads that came from repurposed webinar content, which I can talk to what those looked like later. But that's how they were coming in, and then they were going straight to that form, filling it out, and some of those were converting as well. And so that's sort of what I mean by willing to fill out several question form so that they could take the next step to hire a marketer.
It's interesting. I don't want to take us too far off topic, but something just popped into my head. I mean, if you think about best practices from say 2015 and before, it was make your forms as short as possible, a couple of fields, because you want to kind of remove as much friction and whatnot. And now we're almost going the pendulum swinging the other way, where it's like, well, no. Let's really make sure people really want what we're offering, because otherwise we're just flooding the sales team with God knows what kind of crappy lead quality. So I'm curious, on your thoughts of where's that happy medium for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it depends on what your product is, right? So Dooley is a completely different business model, and both are good, by the way. But with Dooley, it's product led, right? And it's software, and so there's an easy entry of experiencing the free trial, right? And so it really is just connecting Salesforce, and that's it. That's the whole form, and there's no form. But then for something like a Marketer Hire, there is sort of an ideal customer and fit, and it's a little bit more custom, I would say, finding one matching we have to like match people with the right marketer. And to do that, we need some context of their business, their stage, where are their gaps, like what do they need help with in terms of marketing? And then even like a little bit of the project scope and what they're trying to accomplish. And so because the solution is more custom, and because essentially the solution is people, like rather than a product or a software, it kind of warrants like a form, and even like a longer form, rather than just an entry point into the product.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring it up. I think that the key there is it depends based on your business model and the business you're in. Because I can definitely echo that in terms of if you're in a service-based business of any kind, you're going to need actually a little bit more. And the other thing I guess maybe even add to that is it's usually not the form that creates the friction or removes the friction. It's everything you're doing prior to them getting to that form, right? So if you're not educating your person enough, then that 15 field form is going to create a lot of friction. But if they're well educated, they're not going to care. They understand why they need to fill out those fields and whatnot, or vice versa. If you've already, done, again, from a software perspective, like you said, if they're software led, then you don't even need the form. The education happens once they get into the product.
Yeah. I think it goes back to like giving, and we'll get into this, but giving people all the context and all the content that they need to be able to make a decision. And then once I make a decision, I'm willing to fill out a longer form because I've like chosen this business as, or I've identified this business as the right fit, right? And so I think especially for something like consulting, like I expect to have to go through, whether it's a longer form or a longer discovery call, I expect that to be part of the process. In fact, like I would be a little bit worried if it wasn't. And then, for something like software, I also expect to be able to experience like a free trial, right? And so it's kind of goes back to kind of like user love and user expectations in general.
Yeah, that's Gabby. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, let's get back to our topic at hand. I know this is a fascinating topic, and I'm glad that we explored it, but let's set the stage up for our listeners. So, Camille, you're going to talk to us today about a series of webinars that you helped produce at Marketer Hire. And so let's talk a little bit about what the purpose of for those webinars were, what was the intent, what were you trying to do? And then more specifically, let's talk about the content repurposing, because that is what we all want to know about. I mean, everybody nowadays is thinking, okay, how do I create more online experiences for my ideal customer? Webinars is the solution because we're really not doing a ton of in-person meetings. I mean, even though they're still happening, but webinars are more accessible, they're more available, they're not necessarily easier to put on, but let's say the barrier to entry, the barrier to getting people to come on is a lot less than committing to an in-person event. So let's talk about kind of what were that series of webinars, what was that, what was it all about, and what was the intent behind them? And then specifically, how did you go about repurposing all of that content?
Yeah, good question. So with any sort of big pillar type play, like pillar content in general, you have to take the time to develop like a strategy behind it. So for something like Marketer Hire, the topic could have just been marketing, right? Especially because we had different marketers like that covered growth marketing, that covered email marketing. So we could have kept it really broad. And then I think one thing that we did that was smart or ended up being a good play was to find like the niche. And so for us, that was so CMOs, like we decided, hey, like we're going to talk to CMOs. They're the decision makers. They're the ones that are wanting to like build the perfect marketing team. And we want to be able to show them that, or like how we fit into that, and how it doesn't all have to be in-house marketers or full-time marketers, like the different ways that you can go about building a team and who you should think about hiring first. And so we really like went about it, in terms of talking about marketing ops, like marketing operations and hiring. And we're like, we're going to stay there. There's lots of other tempting things to talk about within marketing, but just keeping it focused. And so once we had that focus of like, we're just going to cover marketing ops and we're just going to be talking to CMOs, then everything else got a little bit easier because all of the questions kind of revolved around that of, who do you hire first? Do you hire like a growth marketer or a brand marketer first, for instance? When do you bring in freelancers? So these were all questions that were, I would say, product led, right? Where that they all were at that intersection of what our actual expertise was, but then also like the product that we were able to provide. And so by keeping it focused, all of the answers that we got were things that made sense to use in our content later and that helped drive our mission. And so it's always cool to see that because we weren't the people answering the questions, we were asking the questions. And then we had, top tier CMOs from well-known companies basically talking about how they would use the product. Even if they weren't using marketer hire, they were talking about how and when they use freelancers, which was essentially our product. And so that's the number one thing when you're starting out a webinar, starting out a podcast, is figuring out like not just what the topic is, but like where's like that niche where you need to play, and that will get you the type of content that you can repurpose. So it starts with strategy.
I'm curious with one other thing, which is how did you decide on webinars being that engine versus like a podcast, like you mentioned, or a video series, or a million other different things you can do that in theory can have the same effect? Why webinars?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was two things. One, like it's easy to repurpose a webinar into a podcast. And so even though we didn't end up doing that, I think by starting with a webinar, you're able to create that community as well. And that's something that you can't do as well, or really at all, I guess, with a podcast, because there's not people live. You're not able to feed off of the audience, like for some of those questions and for basically customer research. Like sometimes the questions that would be in the chat would give us insight into objections, right? Or give us insight into, what our audience cared about. So I think it's smart because you can repurpose the webinar into a podcast. You can't do it the opposite way. So that was kind of reason number one. And then two, just to also kind of get the community play going.
I love it. I'm actually really enthusiastic about that response because it makes a lot of sense. I think that, don't get me wrong, we love podcasts here. We actually have 2 podcasts ourselves, and we love being on podcasts and we like consuming podcasts. But I think it's a really smart insight that you just shared with us. And I want to underscore that for our listeners, is that, with generally a podcast is a more passive form of content consumption, because there, yes, it's, your episode could be released on, let's say, a Wednesday, but somebody might listen to it on Friday, right? Or they might listen to it on Saturday. They might not listen to it in chronological order. They might only listen to one episode because they're really interested in this one particular guest. And the rest of the content is maybe not as valuable to them or interesting to them. So, which is interesting, because I think that's also the beauty of a podcast, is that it allows your guest, your listener, to sort of pick and choose how and when they listen. But a webinar, by contrast, like you mentioned, Camille, is a lot more active. People are actively participating. They're choosing to come at this exact time, at this location, whether it's virtual or online, and they're actively, or at least hopefully, they're actively engaged in asking questions and responding to prompts by the host and by the guest speakers. So brilliant distinction there. I wanted to just call that out. So you've set the stage for us. You were really deliberate about choosing the exact target audience with whom you wanted this content to resonate with, the exact personas that would be reflected in your guest speakers, and then also the fact that the medium was going to be webinar, not something else. Let's dive into next the repurposing of this content, because what comes out of a webinar is, hours of recorded content, both visual and audio. But then also I'm based on some of the things you mentioned, you also had a chat function. So what were the pieces that you were repurposing, and how were you looking, what was your strategy when you thought about the audio, the video, and even some of that written dialogue, that chat content? What was your strategy? What was your plan of attack when you said, we have to repurpose this content?
Yeah. So I think I had seen other people, like specifically Chris Walker, everybody at this point I think knows from LinkedIn. But a couple things that stood out to me with what he was doing was, one, I had this light bulb moment of, oh, like the old school talk radio is kind of back, not in the content itself, but in like the formatting of the content, of people essentially calling in, right, through this webinar to ask questions. So that's one part on the creation of the webinar. But then on the back end, like how he was repurposing that content for social and in those bite-sized chunks. And there are others as well, but the topic that he was covering was probably the more similar to what Marketer Hire was doing at the time. And so that's why I felt strongly that would work, or at least it was worth testing. And then we really didn't have to invest too much, I felt like, to repurpose it. And so the strategy going into it was to hire a video editing agency. And so had done a little bit of research on that and kind of identified a few, and went forward with one. And then for the actual recording of the webinars, we just use Zoom. So not in the highest quality audio or video, but an easy way to get started, and technology that we already had. And so really, like, that was all the tech that was needed. And so afterwards, what would happen is I would download the episode directly from Zoom, and then I would during the episodes I would often take notes, like when I felt like there was a strong timestamp of, oh, I really liked this answer to this question, or whatever it is. If something stood out, I would kind of make note of it, and to make the back end work a little bit easier. But then after the webinar, usually like the day after, I would go through especially listen to those things that I had already flagged as being probably the strongest answers. And then I would suggest, essentially do the editing on paper. Like I would say, I like these clips, and then I would write headlines. And so I'd try and do two or three headlines per clip. And the purpose for that is we knew that we wanted to use these in ads. And so having multiple headlines, multiple clips that we can test, just helps us not waste money, basically. Helps us to test early and often what was working on the front end, so that we could take those learnings over to the next webinar and the next webinar, right? And I'd usually have I think two or three strong clips to start with from those. For some attendees, it might be, or guests, I should say, it might be more like 6 or 7. Some of them were really strong in terms of what worked for us to repurpose, and what kind of drove home our message and helped educate people. But that was kind of some of the back end work. And then from there, I would basically fill out the brief through the video editor, through the video editing agency's portal. I would fill out a brief, and I'd say, these are the headlines I want, these are the cuts that I want, and send it off. And then we would get that within a day or two, and be able to start testing those paid. But I should mention that before we ever launched any of them as paid, I would I would typically take what I felt was the strongest one, or maybe 2 like in a week, and I would put that up on organic social. And so that's just like an easy way that you can test before you spend any paid advertising money. You can just put it up on social. And so I would put that on our company page. Sometimes I would upload it to my personal, and that worked well for me because a lot of my audience were marketers too. And so so that doesn't always work if you're doing it from an employee account, but it worked this time. So I do both of those things. We kind of like gauge the reaction and have at least like a good like gut reaction on how this would do for paid. And then at that point, we would put some money behind it and test out the different headlines. And then, after a few days or a week, like just go forward with the one that was working the best.
Yep.
And so depending on the content and how evergreen it was, that would depend on how long that we would leave it up there. But we would do that for all the guests.
Awesome.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things I was just thinking about that you mentioned earlier is, you can, why webinars is you can, you didn't in this case, but excuse me, you can repurpose it into a podcast if you want to. And I think that's something like that I think a lot of people miss or don't think about. I think, like, especially, I mean, we have these conversations with clients all the time where you put the word podcast in front of them and they're like, oh my God, we can't do a podcast. And then you start talking to them about, oh, well, let's just do this little video series and let's do a webinar and this and the other. Like, okay, great. And they're like, okay, great. Now we're just going to take all these episodes we recorded and launch them as a podcast. Oh, okay. Now it's sort of all like, it's the same thing, but people don't really think of it, especially if you're not a marketer, you don't really think of it that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's partly a state of mind thing too, because I kind of felt that same way. Like, while I have a podcast now, like it feels like it has to be more produced, like it feels like a big production. Right. And so, but just thinking about what's the difference, like what's the difference between a webinar and a podcast really makes it a little bit less scary.
I want to go back to something you mentioned about identifying the clips, identifying timestamps within the webinar of your guest speaking. For those that know you on LinkedIn, and you have a pretty impressive following, and I think our listeners are going to know exactly who you are, and they admire you and respect you for your deep knowledge and passion for content. I know I do. But a lot of people struggle with content, especially non-marketers, but even marketers, even content marketers struggle with content. So I'm wondering, Camille, if you can give us a little bit of your content magic, fairy dust, whatever it is that magic wand, whatever it is that you intrinsically know or feel, or if you use a framework, or if there is a certain formula that you use to identify, oh, this is a really strong piece of audio content, or this video, these 3 minutes of video clips, this is going to make a really strong video for LinkedIn or YouTube or whatever it is, or Instagram, because I know you repurposed a lot of the webinar content for Instagram. I'm wondering if you can give us a little sneak peek into how you look at content and how you determine what makes a good, compelling piece of content.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, again, like, this is kind of a unique case, I guess, but because I was marketing to essentially myself, I was marketing to other marketers. So I could identify more easily with the ICP that we're trying to go after. It was really sometimes a filter of like, would I engage with this? Like, would I be interested in this? It was a little bit different because I'm obviously not a CMO, and we were more geared toward leadership. And so it's, putting yourself like in that position of, okay, like if I had the pressure of, like hitting these numbers and scaling a team fast, like who would I hire first? And so running through those hypotheticals. And so this is a boring answer, but it all comes back to being where your customer is, right? Like being in the communities. So for instance, like now that I'm at Julie, those communities are more sales focused. And so it's Rev Genius and Pavilion. And so, but then it's also LinkedIn, but it's been like sort of me curating my feed, like trying to get more salespeople in there and connecting with more salespeople, reaching out to them, setting up like one-on-one so that I can start to understand like how they view the world and what they care about and how they talk even, to make that content better, because it's a little bit like more uncomfortable than the other side of things. But I think as far as like a broad sort of framework, things that worked well for the headlines were so direct quotes. Like, so for instance, so one of them, the guy talked about how like growth marketers versus brand marketers, and who should you hire first, right? And so that's like an interesting concept that I like felt like people would care about. And so it was something about like who should you hire first, and maybe there was a version like with those two like kind of pitted against each other. Another way is just so sometimes it would be the question itself, and then sometimes it would be like their quote as the answer. That would be the headline. So there's kind of like two different ways of going about the same thing. So question format, or like the quote format that was like more of a statement of like growth marketers are always the best hire. You know what I mean? And then you're like, oh, why? and so you're interested in that way. Or if it's a question, there's a natural like I need to know the answer type of thing. So, but the key is questions that your audience cares about, right? Like questions that they already have or have, but they wouldn't think to ask. And so, so those are some basic frameworks, but really like the point of a headline or of good copy is like to get you to read the next thing, or in this case, get you to watch the thing. And so, so it was kind of figuring out like, what do they care like most deeply about that they would need to watch to find that answer.
Something you just mentioned that I think is really important, especially like in your case, maybe not as much, because like you said, you were targeting or talking to yourself to a certain extent, targeting yourself. But if you're in a new industry, if you're a marketer coming into a new place that you don't really know, you mentioned curating your feed. Talk about that a little bit more, because I think that's something that a lot of marketers miss or forget or just don't do on LinkedIn or really any other platform. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when I joined Dually, like, and because it's fresh, I can say it can happen really fast. Actually, like the algorithm moves really fast based on whatever you've done that day or that week. And so for instance, when I first came on, I knew my boss and some of my coworkers, and specifically, the salespeople at my org, that they were going to be already connected to our audience and to our customers. And so for me, it was kind of just starting with connecting with all of my colleagues and coworkers, and then LinkedIn will naturally show you, oh, okay, so Mark liked this, Zoe liked this, Ryan liked this. And so as like they would like these types of posts, I would try and, connect with those same people, or at least engage in their posts and follow them. And so kind of taking advantage of the algorithm and how there are the 7 degrees or 3 degrees of like Kevin Bacon, kind of thinking about it like that, of like, okay, let's start with like the close connections that I already have, like my coworkers in this case, that I know are connected to salespeople, and then see in my feed, like, and just be very like aware of why this stuff is in my feed, because at the top it'll say, Zoe liked this post, Ryan liked this post and stuff. And so paying attention to why they liked those things, especially if it was a salesperson from our org liking that, that tells me a little bit about the content that they like. But then 2, like taking the opportunity to connect with that person and to consume their content as well.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the other things I'll throw out there too is what we'll usually do is, or at least I'll go in and go after specific keywords, hashtags, etc., and go, just because it's easy, especially like it's easier for us because we work with a bunch of different clients, so our feeds are maybe have a little more diversity to them. But if you're internal to an org, your feed can become very insular to a certain extent. I think it's important to also go out there and specifically seek out like, okay, let's look at what salespeople from these other, whatever, top 3 big companies in the industry that we're targeting are talking about, right? And connecting with them. Things like that. Like so purposefully curating your feed, I think, like you said, is critical.
Yeah, no, that gave me a couple other tips, I guess, too. So I think that's a good one about following the hashtags. Sometimes those can like overtake my feed. Like I don't like the balance that they've struck there. Like I'd rather
follow the hashtags as much as like using the hashtags to find the people who are in there and then following the specific people.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I think some other things were what pages or groups are they in, like within that community. So for instance, on LinkedIn, like sales humor and daily sales, like those are ones that we partner with anyways. But I also know like they're big hubs, for salespeople. And so that gives you like some insight into the content that they're consuming, what, even just like being in the comments of those, like gives you a lot of insight. So that was another one that I'll bring up is like groups within the groups, right? So even if you're in a community, there's probably a sub community in there, and social, especially, like it can be through hashtags or it can be through groups, but sub communities within the community.
I'd love to spend more time talking about LinkedIn with you, Camille. So hopefully we can add a couple of questions in our lightning round. But sure. I did want to ask you a question about the webinar specifically, and kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of finding that golden piece of content. I'm assuming that when you put together the webinar and you had a team that was working, I recognize that it wasn't just you, it was a team effort. You had a number of questions that were asked specifically to your panel. But as a marketer, and specifically putting your content hat on, when you were thinking about the webinar and listening to it and kind of anticipating the content that would come out of it, did you have specific goals from the content side of things that you were hoping to get out from the webinar? And if so, how did you go about sort of orchestrating that content to be teased out from your panel?
Yeah, so I think some goals that we had with it were for it to become a content flywheel, right? For it to like fuel itself and not only pay for itself, but like but really be like an acquisition channel and a form of content, because we had a newsletter at that time, we had a blog, and so this was just kind of another format of content. And I'll speak sometimes to how sometimes people just need to see it in a different way, like they just need to consume the content in a different format. And so if we were able to have assets in those different formats, in audio, video, long form, short form, then we'd have like more at bats for people to know what we do, consume the content, and potentially convert. And so for me, like being in charge of social, I selfishly like wanted it to kind of fuel the organic social play. But I was also excited to use organic social to test the paid channels as well. And felt like there was a lot of like opportunity there that I didn't see other people doing of repurposing this type of content, which I felt like was really valuable as an ad. Like I saw a lot of ads that looked like ads, right? Or that were ads that weren't content. And so I liked the idea of, I think just in general, like our team liked the idea of being able to have this be a repeatable play. And so ultimately the goal is obviously to drive conversions. And so what I liked about this play was it helped us do two things, like the long-term content strategy and marketing strategy of that comes with a webinar and that comes with like slowly building a community, but then also to help that fuel social. And then I think eventually talking about using that in the newsletter or in like long form content, like knowing that was a possibility. But on the short term, being able to use it for ads and be able to get kind of like that instant gratification and instant revenue that came from that. And so that's what I mean about like it fueling itself in the short term, but also it making sense for kind of just like a long form, like less pressure like on the content side of things.
Yeah, I think one of the things we always talk about with clients is the more you can make your content engine become sort of as part of your everyday workflow, the better off you're going to be, right? Because then because at the end of the day, you need those subject matter experts. They're either going to be customers or they're going to be internal. They don't have time. They don't want to spend the time, etc. You got to make it easy for them to take part in this content creation game. So yeah, I think that makes total sense. The other thing I like what you said is, it's an ad that didn't really look like an ad. I think that's important. I mean, I can't remember who had the quote or who said it or whatever, but it's, the best advertising is the ones that doesn't actually look like advertising. I think you're seeing that more and more these days. You've definitely has been happening on in the B2C world for a while, but you're seeing a little bit more on the B2B side where people are trying non-traditional things with whatever formats they're doing, which I think is great.
Yeah. And I would say in general, like some of the more content focused like ads like tended to do pretty well. And so I guess what I mean by that is it could be this play of taking a clip from a video from especially if it's from an influencer or an expert. So for instance, we had like Nick Sharma on, who's huge in like the D2C world. And in fact, like if you Google D2C guy, he's the first one to come up. And so that was really helpful in driving attendance to that. And it did really well as an ad. But then another guy who we didn't get as much attendance from, but had a lot to say and talk about on like the growth marketing front, which was a really hot topic for us, and then just a really hot topic in general. His ads actually like performed the best. And so sometimes it's the name, obviously like the brand recognition of like a big name for the webinar, like that's helpful. That's helpful for especially getting attendees, and it's helpful for getting that credibility in the ads. But it still was interesting that, at least in this case, the content and like the relevancy to the audience is still number one, like even if you don't have that huge name, because the best performing ads was probably like the least recognized or like not, I wouldn't say like popular, but yeah, least recognized name like out of the bunch.
Yeah, and that makes total sense to me because it's, for the webinar, someone is committing whatever it is, a half hour, hour and a half, however long this thing is, of their time. And they're much more likely to commit that time if it's, oh, wow, that's this guy that I look up to and that I know. With an ad, you are interrupting or whatever it is, right? Their flow. And at that point, it's more about the content than about who it is. Although, if it's a recognizable face, for example, that might make them stop and go, oh, yeah, let me take a look at this kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So Camille, give us a sense of sort of the timeline and the shelf life of the content. So my understanding is it was a series of webinars. Kind of tell us, how long did it take to, prep for the webinar? What was the turnaround time for capturing the content that you wanted to repurpose and chop up and cut up into different formats? And then how long did you use the content, and kind of also talk us through the dissemination of that content?
Yeah, good question. So you kind of have to think about your channels in advance, like when you're repurposing. So for instance, we did some Instagram stories for those, talking to a brand consultant who specialized in Instagram, and her kind of saying, I would go with like 7 seconds, for a good Instagram story. So trying to keep it in that, but also knowing that like 15 was as long as we could go. So keeping that in mind. And then for like the feed content, it would typically be like a minute, maybe 2 minutes in terms of the length. And so that's kind of what we're going for. But again, like if it was really good content, we would just try and capture that, like whether that was short or long. And so, but those in general, I think were the links that we're going for. And then in terms of running the ads, so I should mention, like, I'm not like a paid ad specialist. Like I was supporting on like the content and like the social side of things. But I know that we were running some of these for weeks, potentially like a month. But it really depended on, how well the ad did, right? And kind of the audience fatigue on it. So I know a good, rule of thumb can be like 3 to 4 on like the frequency, and not wanting to necessarily go over that. Like, I think we've all seen like ads 10 times and be like really sick of them by like the 10th time. So there's definitely such a thing as ad fatigue. And so even if it is good content, and you haven't maybe seen or stopped to view it the first few times, like, sometimes it just needs to be a different thing for you to stop in the feed and actually consume it. So taking into consideration those types of things, but they would usually run for a few weeks.
And so thank you for sharing that. And then in terms of the repurposing the content on the organic side, posting it to the company LinkedIn channel or other social company owned social channels, how long were you supporting, so you had the paid campaign going, but then how frequently were you posting or reposting the content from the webinar during the campaign period organically?
Yeah, so it would partly just be how fast that we could get it back, because the first few weeks, like it's still like in learning mode of and it's a little bit slower in like the back and forth between the agency and like finding the clips to cut up and all of that. So it would really depend on like how fast I could get it out. But my aim was kind of to use those as a way to promote the next webinar too. So that's another way that you can think about it. And so I would, do at least one a week, but ideally 2, but we'd promote the next webinar with, an actual like image promo with the picture of the next guest too. So I don't want to overload the feed with just like event promotions. So this was something that I started running into of just doing this like so often and wanting people to show up, but we also had like email running to remind people. And so we started kind of relying more on stories, whether that was LinkedIn stories and Instagram stories to kind of do some of those promotions to keep the rest of the feed clean. Mm-hmm. But the nice thing about repurposing the content as a video is it would be less promotional. It would just be like a clip or an insight from that video. And then I'd have kind of a CTA at the end of the text post, talking that, oh, by the way, this is from our webinar series and we're doing it tomorrow or whatever. Right. And so that's kind of how I thought about that.
That's great. Yeah, the video clips can be used more as informational, right, rather than promotional. So that's another way to repurpose the webinar content. Well, I think you've shown us the proof. I think it's time to get to the point. What do you think, Mike?
I think it is.
So, Camille, this show is all about, the proof in which you tell us about your success story, how you did it, why you did it, and what was the outcome. But we want to take that a step further and actually help educate our listeners and actually give them the step-by-step guidance and tools on how they can replicate your success. So let's talk about, you mentioned that, this was a team effort. You had a team of marketers assembled, plus you had some outside support. Can you talk to us a little bit about that team structure? Who was sort of the running point for this initiative, and what did the makeup of the team look like?
Yeah, sure. So there were four of us on the marketing team, and then I think like a fifth was added like during this show, basically. So basically, Tracy, our director of marketing, she was the host of the show, and so in charge of the show in that way. And then May was our, I think, senior editor at the time, and she would come up with the questions for the show, right? So she would prep those questions, and then I wrote all the copy for the landing pages, for the promotional pieces, and then repurposed the content. So managed the agency and gave them the copy so that we could repurpose the content, and then would work with our growth team, which was Mark at the time, and then later he added an employee as well, and work with them to basically get really organized in terms of just folders, like on Google Drive is how I would do it. Of here's all the promotional content, here's the raw assets, here's the final assets. So essentially, like how I broke it down, and then would just like hand over all of the ready-made assets, like that were ready to go for ads, to him. And then also worth noting is he had his own software, so that if he wanted to try out any other headlines, like he could do that. And then later we kind of refined the process so that we could easily put that in as an agency order, of like, let's do the same clip but with a different headline, like where we could kind of like add those on to the orders. But that was like the whole team involved in this. I think you could feasibly do it with two marketers. It also depends on if you have that in-house resource, which is always nice if you have like a video resource kind of in-house. But it worked really well, honestly, to do it at the agency. But really you need somebody who is either the subject matter expert, who can like lead the discussion, or somebody that can be the host, but then invite like the types of people who are the experts, if that makes sense, like are the subject matter experts. And so you need that person, and then you don't even need, I think, like the landing pages that we had in it. Like you could use just the Zoom invites or the Zoom landing pages. Lots of people do that, and I think that would work fine. And then I think you just need somebody with a copy eye / like an understanding of social or of ads, depending on what you're repurposing it for. And and then I think you just need a video editor or an agency to help you with the production.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think that's important. What you just mentioned is you kind of need that, what I like to call the minimum viable content, right? Like, what's the minimum thing that you can do to get it out there and get feedback? This thing is not going to fail because you used a Zoom landing page versus a HubSpot landing page or like a custom design landing page, right? It's going to fail because the content didn't perform or because you targeted it incorrectly or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that we like to maybe blame like the designs or the production quality or this could have been better, but that's really like the reason.
Yeah. No, and one thing out there too is like, I think you definitely could do it with two marketers if you wanted to. I mean, like some of for our podcast, half of them we have a professional that does all the the editing and the cutting, but then some of the stuff that we record ourselves after the fact, like our Friday episodes, they get posted. I'm just doing all that in Descript, right? We record it on Thursday, I cut up a few things. It takes whatever, an hour and a half, and there's 4 videos out the door.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're speaking to the point too, and that you could do with one person, right? Like there's plenty of people that have their own podcast that use Descript or use Zoom, and that's it. Like that's like all you really need to get started. I would say to kind of like put more gasoline on the fire to be able to kind of like do that full flywheel effect. Like it's nice to have more than that, right? And in our case we did, and so it was nice to be able to split it up that way, because it really was like playing to everybody's strengths. But you could get this done with one person.
I'm curious, what do you think? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gabby.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask, like, what do you think are the biggest challenges or pitfalls that people would maybe fall into? I mean, we just mentioned one is sort of overthinking and going too big right away, but what else comes to mind?
Yeah, it's always just getting started, right? Like, even with any new writing project that I have, like it's always just getting started. That's the hard part. And it's not that I don't like writing the intros or I don't like getting started. Like it's just the idea like of getting started. It always feels like you're a million miles away, like from the finish line. And so So that's I think like the number one hurdle. Some other things that you'd kind of already mentioned is
before you go to there, I'm curious, what do you do to get over that hurdle? Like, what can someone do to get started more often and faster?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just asking an AE, like a salesperson, a similar question, and I liked her answer, which was basically consistent persistence. So essentially, like, she's like, you just do it. She's like, even you're not going to feel it like every day. Like, you're not going to feel inspired every day. And she was talking specifically to sales. And she's like, the best salespeople just do it. Like, they just do the calls or do the email outreach, like even when they're not feeling it. And it's like the gains that you get from doing it every day. That's the reward to it. So I think apart from that, sometimes it depends on the medium, right? But I'll use written content as an example. It's like making an outline, like being like, okay, I can just make an outline. You know what I mean? Like, that's not scary. And so, but then once you have like the outline, then the writing part's not scary, right? So it's just like one step at a time. Of I don't have to do it all today, but I'm gonna do like one part of it today. I think the second thing that helps is when I imagine like being like a day before the deadline or hours before the deadline, and being in that place that I don't like to be. And so that can help that can help just like get on the right track of okay, like I'll just do step one today because I know that I'm just going to put it off again tomorrow. Like, I have to do it today. And you know, and once you're doing it, like I typically like doing it. And so it's just getting over that hurdle.
Yeah,
So
sure.
since we're going down this path, I have to ask a LinkedIn related question because it relates to what we were talking about.
Mhm.
You know, you mentioned consistent persistence. Is that the same mantra that you would use or that you do use for creating and generating the content that you share on LinkedIn as a thought leader?
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I would say it depends on like what stage of the journey that you're at too. So at the beginning, and it's actually been, I think tomorrow, funny enough, like I think tomorrow is like a year from when I was like, okay, I'm going to post every day, right? Like on LinkedIn. So it's been almost a full year now. And when I started, I just had to decide, you know, I just had to say, okay, I am going to post every day for the rest of this year. And I won't commit, but beyond that, but at least
does
for the
that
rest of this year.
include weekends? Curious.
That at the time that included weekends. So
okay.
So yeah, so it was just like going all in. I don't think you have to do that, by the way. I think plenty of people are taking off their weekends, and like in retrospect, I might advise that, but it depends on where you are. So I think at like sub 1,000 followers maybe, and so yeah, so I recognized, I think, like the opportunity of posting on weekends, because essentially you get lower supply, higher demand, right? So people are still scrolling at that time and seeing the content, but less people are creating.
Especially if you're targeting the C-suite or the leaders in whatever industry, like that's when they're actually active.
Yeah, no, so that's like a good point. Yeah, they're busy during their heads down, maybe like during the
during the weekday.
work week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. One final question, then I think it's time for our lightning round. But circling back to the point, and you know, you shared with us a little bit about the team structure and who was responsible for what, and kind of the ideal number of folks that can execute a project like this. Let's talk about the tool stack that you used to execute this campaign.
Yeah, so the tool stack used to execute the webinar campaign, right?
Yep.
Okay. So Zoom, HubSpot. So we use HubSpot for the landing pages to stand those up, and then yeah, an agency to cut up the video. So we didn't use Descript, but I think that would be a good alternative. And that's pretty much it. Word docs, Google Doc or Google Drive, you know, that's kind of like where we kept all the assets and how to stay organized.
Did
That's really
you
it.
have any social scheduling or social listening tools?
So I would occasionally use HubSpot, but then I just found that LinkedIn doesn't like that. Like they don't like scheduling tools very much, and I kind of liked being able to change on the fly too. And so I would typically like just post native to the platform.
Okay, awesome. Well, Camille, thank you so much. You've shown us the proof. You've gotten to the point. Now it's time for our lightning round. All right. What is the main KPI you use to evaluate marketing success?
Revenue. Like if it's driving revenue, you might have, slightly different things that you're gold on. For content, it might be traffic, or it might be signups. But I think ultimately, like, you should be driving somebody closer to a conversion. Or
Yep, got it. What's a new marketing strategy or tactic that you're looking forward to testing out this year, or something perhaps that you've already tested this year?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple things. I think I'm really interested, and I did this in a recent podcast episode of mine. Interviewed somebody that's done a template library, so I'm interested in exploring that and kind of exploring some other SEO tactics. So those are some things, and then I think the main thing though is focus, right? So it's like, so for me, I think there's still like lots of opportunity on LinkedIn. So it's like staying focused is that kind of being my core, that being a core channel for both Julie and then myself. And then just adding this new podcast. Like, it's tempting to be like, oh, like maybe I should be doing like a newsletter because I'm seeing other people do that, right? Maybe I should be doing these other things, being on TikTok, right? But for me, like, and just the time that I want to spend, you have to consider this too, like in your content creation. It makes more sense for me to just do those things better, right? And so for now, like, my podcast is still new, so doing that better.
I love that answer. Here at Proofpoint, on a side note, we said that 2021 was going to be the year of focus for us. And we actually, as a company, are only engaging on LinkedIn. Also YouTube to house our podcast episodes, but our primary channel is LinkedIn. So I am 100% there with you and agree with that. I think that's a brilliant answer. And I think it's also smart for anyone listening out there, content creators or aspiring content creators. Think about your time commitment. Think about where you want to spend that time and where you can have the most impact. So great advice there, Camille. What is a tool or platform that you use in your work and that you couldn't live without?
The other day I said LastPass, but our company uses 1Password too. So either of those, big fan of not having to enter my password. So I know that's kind of a goofy one, but very true. Yeah, I think it's probably some of the other things that we mentioned as well. LinkedIn, I think, is obviously like a huge channel and like tech for us, and so that's one. Slack, I don't know that like we'd be able to work like as a remote team without Slack. So those are my big ones.
100%. What is your most favorite or least favorite business word or phrase?
Probably least favorite is synergy, and that goes way back for me. I don't hear people like say it, to be fair, as much anymore, but and then like adding value like has become a little bit of a pet peeve for me too. I'm sure I say it as well, but adding value doesn't really add very much value to the conversation.
I remember I either wrote a blog post or I started a blog post about that, like back when it was sort of at its peak. I'm like, okay, that's enough. Like, you're not actually adding value with your value.
Yeah, exactly.
Synergy is one that we hear a lot on this show, and I would agree with that. But I also am not encountering it as much in my day-to-day life anymore. So I think people are getting the hint about that.
It's kind of coming back a little bit, though. I feel
Is
like.
it? Oh, I haven't noticed.
I feel like
All
it's
right.
become almost like okay because people haven't been saying it anymore.
All right. Next question. What are some of the podcasts that you listen to most frequently?
My favorites are State of Demand Gen. I also like there's one called Top of Mind. So those are both marketing podcasts that I really enjoy. I should probably plug my podcast.
There you go.
Probably.
There you go.
Listen to Content Logistics. Yeah, there's 3 episodes out right now. So
Awesome. Awesome.
Anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Sweet. All right. What are your favorite business or marketing books?
Yeah. So the one that I just read, and again, like this, I guess this falls under business, but it's a sales and like life book in some ways of and of course I'm blanking on it right now, but oh yeah, so Chris Voss's like Never Split the Difference.
Okay.
So it's all about like negotiation, right? And like the tactics like used in negotiation. But I think it really teaches like listening, like how to be a better listener. And then I've also tried to use like these tactics on my 2-year-old, and it doesn't really work, but still working on that. And then I think it's also helpful for copy, because copy is essentially written sales, right? So I think that's been one of the more helpful ones recently.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of that one, and that one myself. They've been on my nightstand for, I don't know, over a year probably since it first came out. Just finally getting to it. But it's interesting what I'm seeing now is there are a lot of, it's really spread like wildfire through the sales scene. And there's a lot of like junior sales reps that are, it's almost like they read the cover and like the back, and maybe read a couple of Josh Brown posts, and they're just spewing like the tactics without really understanding what it is. And it's kind of driving me a bit nuts.
Yeah, no, it's it's pretty different than like what I thought that it would be. And like I'm for instance like a fan of like Josh Braun's stuff as well. And that's probably like what turned me onto it. I had heard about the book before, and obviously like Chris before, but like I said, it's really just about like good communication, and it turns out like when you communicate well, like good things happen.
100%. I was going to say, from a personal perspective, we have a 5-year-old who's turning 6 soon. So 2 is tough, right? 2 is really tough. Give it a few years, and then I think you'll be able to see more communication and negotiation, and you'll be able to use some of those tactics a little bit, because we struggled with our daughter when she was 2, but now that she's 5, we're able to have much more discourse and communication.
She beats us in negotiation all
and
the time.
She does. Yeah,
that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, I keep telling Mike, like, our daughter could be like our best negotiator. We should just train her up and have her take over Proofpoint or join us one of these days. Yep. All right, but last but not least, who is a B2B marketing expert that you admire on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can come up with like a more original answer here. I really like Devin Reed, like the content strategist at Gong. I think he's really smart. Have talked to him once before, but just the way that he thinks through things, and I think his stuff specifically appeals because like every post is great, and then his long form stuff is great too, and that's hard to do, I think, like as a content marketer, to do both of those things like really well. And then how he's executed for Gong, definitely have a lot of respect for him.
Awesome. That is a new answer that we haven't received on the show, and I like that. I like hearing who people like and admire and respect on LinkedIn, because there's so many great folks doing wonderful things. So Devin, we'll hopefully maybe have him on the show at one point. Camille, it's been so delightful to have you on the show. Again, we loved your rendition of the 2021 Sales Oddity. So if you want to give us a few bars, you can. No pressure, of course. But what's the best way for anyone listening today to connect with you?
Yeah, you can go find me on LinkedIn. That's still the best place probably to get a hold of me. But LinkedIn, Camille Trent should come up. And then also, I mentioned Content Logistics, so like new project for me. but that's the podcast. And it's exactly what it sounds like. I just try and walk through like the beginning, middle, and end of creating some form of content and try and walk through a different strategy every other week.
Awesome. Well, inquiring minds want to know, will there be a follow-up musical number on LinkedIn that we can look forward to?
I didn't even address your question. I probably won't do the bars here, although I do have the piano right here. But yeah, I can commit to another musical performance. I think you heard it here.
We're gonna hold you to it. You heard it here, folks.
Right.
Do you have a background in music? Is that something that you can share with us?
I learned, I took piano lessons growing up, and so I'm not as good. I hesitate to tell people that because I'm not as good as I should be with that being my background. But yeah, I did take some piano lessons growing up.
Awesome. Well, you've heard it here first. This is an exclusive on Show Me the Proof, Get to the Point, that Camille Trent will be releasing another LinkedIn hit.
Another single.
Camille, it was lovely having you on. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing about this really exciting case study and success story that you did at Marketer Hire, repurposing webinar content, and just everything that kind of went into that, the thought process behind it, and the dissemination. So thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for listening, and we'll look forward to bringing you another show next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Show Me the Proof, Get to the Point podcast. Join us weekly for new episodes and seriously smart B2B marketing success stories. We'll show you the proof and get to the point every time. Find additional resources on the Proofpoint website, www.proofpoint.marketing, including the full episode library with show notes, guides, templates, and more great resources. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts.